In this video, I'm going to talk about three common mistakes related to staining process, wood staining process. And these are mistakes I have done and I've learned to avoid them. That's what I'm sharing. So mistake number one is to not stagger the staining process, meaning it's better to leave the entire staining process at the end of the project. So if there is a project with drawers and doors and with a mix of lumber like hardwood lumber and plywood, it's just better to wait until the end to stain the whole thing. This is an example where I finished this kitchen cabinet carcasses, and in order to sort of manage time, I decided to just go ahead and stain them before I finished the drawers and the shaker doors for them. And when I finished my drawer fronts and I tried to stain the drawer fronts, I could not get them to match. I could not get my drawer fronts to get dark enough to match the carcass itself. And I should have waited until the end to experiment and try out test pieces with the carcass lumber as well as the hardwood lumber together to make sure my process, the whole staining process, is giving out the same intensity of color. The second mistake to avoid is to not over sand any lumber, whether it's hardwood lumber or plywood. I'm using oak over here. And the important thing to remember is that stain needs to penetrate the wood. So anything we do to smoothen it too much or sand it, over sanding, makes such a smooth layer that it makes it difficult for the stain to penetrate. So that's why it shouldn't be over sanded. And I think about 120 or maybe 150 is enough for oak. And it might, the range might define, the limit might be dependent upon the kind of wood, but that's why we need to test all the pieces, the actual pieces that are being used in the project. We should test out with them how much sanding is required for that. But in general, I think going over 180 is not a good idea for staining. This is an example where I have this oak plywood, like I said, and I overstained it to about 320 grit, and I can almost see the plies or let's say the veneer on top of the plywood that are usually how plywood is built, and I couldn't get the stain to penetrate enough because it's too smooth, and I cannot, and because of that I could not get them at the same color. Here, the same example, I sanded down to about 320 degrees down here, but up here in the middle I sanded to only about 120, and the same plywood looks completely different. It's evenly stained, evenly colored on both sides, on the whole section of this plywood. So in short, not to over sand it, or basically not to do anything that will stop the penetration of the stain, like things like wiping the wood with mineral spirits. Mineral spirits is oil based, and if wiped with mineral spirits, it sort of creates an oily layer that also stops the penetration of wood. So if mineral spirits is used, it has to be given enough time to dry so all the oil dissipates, and then it allows the stain to penetrate properly. Another thing to remember is also to sand all the pieces to the same level. So if it's a lumber or plywood, if you decide on a sanding grit, it has to be the same grit. If you decide that 150 is the grit I reach the max grit, then all the pieces, as you sand from lower grit to upper grit, you decide on that limit, and all the lumber pieces should stop at that grit. That's how it'll have the same, let's say, porousness, or it'll have all the pieces will have the same ability to absorb the stain. Some people also mix mineral spirits with the stain oil. So if it's an oil-based stain, they would probably mix mineral spirits. If it's a water-based stain, they might mix it with some thinner, and that's just to really help the stain penetrate more into the wood. The third mistake to avoid is to apply stain on a dirty or unclean wood. Once the sanding is done, it's always a better idea to clean it up. So the first thing to do is vacuum the surface of the wood so it picks up all that fine dust from the sanding, and then to use some kind of liquid to wipe and clean the wood. So the best thing to use, I think, is this 50-50 ratio of denatured alcohol and water. I just bought denatured alcohol, get it at any home store, and put it in this cheap sprayer, and I use it when I need it. So I spray it liberally on top of the wood and then wipe it off. This also helps in opening up the grain even more. So when water and alcohol is put on wood, it evaporates eventually, but it permanently opens up the pores in the wood, and that helps even more for the oil penetration. It's better to not use things like mineral spirits, because mineral spirits takes a long time. It can be used, but I think it takes a long time to dissipate and creates like an oily layer. I think this mixture of alcohol, denatured alcohol and water is best. Now that I have covered the three mistakes, the common mistakes to avoid, I'll give a few extra notes on top of that. Now, it's always a good idea to just play around with the stain. So if you have extra lumber, and I'm talking about the lumber and plywood with which the actual project was made, if you take that, if you have some extra, it's best to buy extra and then test out on top of it. And there are certain variables or parameters that you can play with, and I'll list those out. Look at whether you need the pre-stain conditioner. That's number one. Maybe you won't need it. Things like pine, wood like pine, it may be absolutely necessary, but things like oak, it is porous enough that there may not be any need, and it might not make any difference at all actually using a pre-stain. But on certain other kinds of wood, it makes a lot of difference. Number two, I talked about sanding already. Just decide on what grit would you limit to. So use it to 150 and use 150 on all the pieces, whether it's plywood or hardwood lumber. Number three, decide how long you want to leave the stain. The general process recommended is to over apply stain and then wipe it off. And when you over apply, you leave it, or you can wipe it instantaneously, or you can wipe it after 10 minutes or 15 minutes or half an hour. Play around with that, see how long you want to leave it. Then when you wipe it, number four, how much pressure you need to put to wipe it. If you wipe it with high pressure, it will take more off, it'll get lighter. If you wipe it with low pressure, then it'll leave more stain and it'll darken it. Number five, you test it out in different kinds of wood. So every wood, like I said, will take stain differently. Sometimes red oak plywood will take stain differently than red oak hardwood. So just play around with that. And then number six, clean, vacuum and clean properly. And that will also make a difference in how the stain pops out. So thanks for watching.